What's going on, everyone? James Hancock here, back to review the new film Gemini Man. There's very little about this movie that can be spoiled, so I'll happily make this review spoiler-free in any event. Gemini Man was directed by Ang Lee and stars Will Smith, or maybe I should say starring Will Smith and Will Smith, in that this film features a completely CGI version of Will Smith, with which the older version of Will Smith spends the majority of the movie duking it out, having car chases, etc. If you've seen the trailer, you know the drill, but Will Smith plays a military assassin who wants to retire, whereupon his former employers try to take him out using a clone of him that they've been training in secret for years. Apart from one really sensational action scene, this CGI gimmick really is the feature attraction of Gemini Man, so the question is whether or not it's worth it to throw down some cash and see this on the big screen. The short answer, in my opinion, unfortunately, is no. But if you're curious as to why, let me give you the long answer. Like a lot of people, I thought they simply used de-aging technology, but Ang Lee in several interviews has spoken about his desire to push the FX of this movie into new terrain, in particular using the very high frame rate of 120 frames per second. But Ang Lee really wanted to prove that they could create an emotionally compelling CGI character that would cross the so-called uncanny valley for the viewer, where we accept the character as a living, breathing human being alongside the rest of the cast, as well as the Will Smith that we know and love. And I'll admit there are a few scenes that are incredibly convincing, but there are just as many where his movements, but more importantly his face, will just leave you kind of bewildered as to how they made it into the final cut of the film. The last scene in particular, I had to stop myself from saying out loud, like, what the fuck? Because it looks like the movie just ran out of money and they decided to just do the best they could under the circumstances and call it a day. But in addition to the CGI character, Ang Lee also is a big believer in what he believes is the immersive power of high frame rates. So he decided to shoot the entire movie in 120 frames per second, 4K 3D. Now that sounds great in theory, but the problem is that apart from a handful of theaters around the country, nobody's actually going to see the movie in that format. I read a really interesting article over at Polygon where they described how not one single theater in the US is actually going to play the movie in the correct format. The article does include a list of 14 theaters where they will be projecting it at 120 frames per second with 2K resolution, but none in 4K. Furthermore, half the 3D screens in the country that are playing the movie are only going to be showing it at 60 frames per second. And when I read this, I immediately got really annoyed. I'm a big believer in seeing a film precisely the way a director intended for the audience to experience it. But what's the point of all that expense and groundbreaking special effects and technique if the studio you're working with, in this case Paramount, or the theater chains, have no interest in rolling out the film the way we're supposed to see the movie? To me, that just seems like a massive breakdown in communication between the filmmaker and the studio that in the end will almost certainly lead to a lot of audience members, myself included, feeling very frustrated. Almost out of a stubborn sense of spite, I decided just to say screw it and saw it at the closest theater within walking distance, hoping that the story and the performances would be enough to grab me in the absence of Ang Lee's groundbreaking visuals that nobody really will get a chance to see. If, like me, you were alive in the 1990s and watched a lot of action movies, this movie is going to be a strange retro experience for you because the screenplay's apparently been banging around Hollywood since 1997 with multiple rewrites along the way with many different directors and stars attached at different times. Directors Curtis Hanson and Tony Scott, neither of whom are even with us any longer, both took a stab at it, while Harrison Ford, Mel Gibson, Clint Eastwood, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, and Sean Connery have all been attached at different points to star in the movie. I have no idea how many screenwriters have taken a pass on the material, but David Benioff of Game of Thrones fame still has both a story by credit as well as a writing credit, so I imagine he was one of the earlier writers to work on it. But 20 years of rewrites have basically whittled this movie down to the most generic, predictable action movie I've seen in quite some time, which for me is not necessarily a bad thing. I've seen countless generic action movies, and I've enjoyed a lot of them. In general, I'm a big believer in unpretentious genre entertainment, but if you want people to get off their couch and head to the theater, you have to give them a really compelling reason to do so, because back in the 1990s, cable and VHS and eventually DVDs really couldn't compete with the theatrical experience. Nobody was on their phones. Very few people had some big, beautiful setup at home, so I'd go to the theater all the time to see the latest action movies. But now people have a lot more options, and Gemini Man has an estimated budget of $138 million, which I predict is going to bite this movie on the ass. It should have been like a $5 million movie starring Jean-Claude Van Damme like Double Impact back in the early 90s. What's funny, though, is that if you didn't know the movie was written in the late 90s, you would think that it was some sort of stylish or deliberate nod to the escapist entertainment of a bygone era, but it's not a stylistic choice. It's just a straight-up 90s action movie that never got made, and with good reason, until now. And to make the 90s flavor complete, Jerry Bruckheimer is one of the producers on the movie. In the late 90s, Jerry Bruckheimer was producing flicks like The Rock, Con Air, and Armageddon. His style of action, for better or for worse, pretty much defined mainstream Hollywood action movies at that time. And Ang Lee was really finding his stride in the late 90s as well, with movies like The Ice Storm, which is awesome, Ride with the Devil, and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. It makes me wonder what this movie could have been like if they just made it in the 90s and simply used makeup to make one of the Will Smith characters look older, and then for any moment where they need to be on the same screen at the same time, just rely upon older, less expensive special effects like those used in movies like David Cronenberg's Dead Ringers. But this is the movie that we have, and as I mentioned before, there really was only one scene that knocked my socks off. The motorcycle scene from the trailer is part of a much larger chase scene that I have to admit was pretty goddamn cool, apart from one really silly shot where Will Smith basically does this kind of reverse belly flop off the ground to dodge an attack. The big problem is that the dialogue and the structure are so flat, so bland, and on several occasions, I caught myself mouthing the next words that the characters were about to say. That's not a good sign. But Mary Elizabeth Winstead was pretty cool, and it's interesting to see how she's starting to switch gears more into the action genre. She's also in the upcoming movie Birds of Prey as Huntress. Clive Owen, he does what he can with the material given to him, but his character feels like he was plucked straight out of hundreds of other movies of a similar nature. The only ingredient that made the movie watchable for me was Will Smith. He does all the heavy lifting on this one, and just through raw talent and charisma, he almost manages to make this a good movie by sheer will alone. In the end, however, what we have is a classic example of a movie without a soul, where all the fancy special effects in the world can't defeat one of the oldest rules of showbiz. If it ain't on the page, it ain't on the stage. And Will Smith, frankly, just deserves better material. You could throw a dart at my bookshelf and find a novel or a comic that would have been cooler for him. And Will Smith, he's one of the few legit movie stars we have left, and I feel like the people that are on his team, either his management or his representation or whatever producers he's working with, they need to do a much better job of scrounging for cool material. But Will Smith, he already started one of the biggest movies of 2019, so I'm sure he's going to shrug this off without too many problems. Paramount as a studio is already struggling big time, and I imagine that this movie is only going to deepen their woes. But I think that's about all I have to say about Gemini Man for now, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this sucker up. If you want to talk about late 90s action movies, you can find me on Twitter at Colbrax. But if you enjoyed this review, please consider subscribing to my channel, liking the video, all that good stuff, or sharing it if you feel so inclined. But I can't thank you enough for watching. Hope everyone has an amazing weekend, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.